rural guerrilla war was born because the coordination between the urban working classes uprising in Santiago de Cuba and the invasion of the Grandma and the Movimiento de 26 de Julio never actually coordinated. Nevertheless, the cities remained in rebellion, and as Castro's men regrouped in the countryside, they didn't really seem that much of a threat. In 1957, Batista clamped down very hard on the cities in rebellion, right? This had a couple of important effects. It meant that Castro and his men who had moved to the mountains were now isolated from the more general revolutionary movement as the people in the cities were rebelling against Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship. As Batista pounded the urban revolution, it also eliminated any competition that Castro might have had for his leadership. It also drove many people out of the cities into the hills to take up arms in the countryside. Basically, what happens is that because Batista is able to crush the rebellion in the cities, the rebels are driven out of the cities into the countryside where they join Castro, right? Now, by this point, Batista has largely forgotten about Castro, except that in 1957, February of that year, the New York Times sent senior editor Herbert Matthews down to Cuba to do a story on Castro and his so-called barbudos. Barba in Spanish means beard. Of course, these men allowed their beards to grow very long as they trained and struggled to maintain the revolution in the mountains, right? So they were called the barbudos. And in 1957, Herbert Matthews, this editor for the New York Times, did an interview with Castro and introduced the barbudos to the world. So much for Batista's claim that Castro's forces had been wiped out. Now, Castro believed that the rural guerrilla struggle in the mountains outside of the cities was the correct one. And this is especially true given how much urban efforts at propaganda, agitation, and strikes seemed insufficient to dislodge Batista from power. The rural struggle looked more successful because Castro had been able to sustain this movement in the mountainsides, in the mountains. Remember, the movement had begun with only about 15 people, and it had been growing and growing. But really, one of the reasons that this movement had been able to grow was because Batista was so busy pounding the insurrection in the cities that he ignored the countryside, allowing the rebels to regroup there. And the rural struggle, as a result, looked more successful. Castro emerged as the leader as a result. Now, people in the urban areas of Cuba who had coordinated their uprising with Castro were quick to notice that Castro was taking all the credit for the early successes of the revolution. One person who was involved in the leadership in the cities said, and I quote, "I believe very strongly in the role of the leader of our revolution. But I believe that the collaborators cannot be a group of extras who provide only the appearance of democracy, a chorus who praises his successes." Thus, even before the revolution was successful, did it become clear that there were some anti-democratic tendencies ingrained in the leader of this revolution, Mr. Fidel Castro himself. But nevertheless, as the urban uprisings were crushed by Batista's forces, and as journalists went into the countryside to interview these rebels who had taken up the cause of guerrilla warfare in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, quickly the rural part of the revolution emerged as perhaps the most important part of the revolution, and frankly the international press found the rural guerrillas more interesting and more romantic than their student or working class urban counterparts. In any case, the revolution continued to put pressure upon Batista, and before very long, the United States, recognizing the illegitimacy of Batista's dictatorship, stopped supplying him with money. At this point, Batista, seeing that he was losing his grip on power, at last turned the army loose on the guerrillas who then went into the mountainside, forced to recognize that Castro still had a very powerful movement in the countryside. But Batista's men were unable to get their equipment into the mountains, and Batista was only able to send foot patrols after Castro's camps. these foot patrols were easily defeated by the seasoned guerrillas who had spent the better part of a year training themselves in the principles of guerrilla warfare in the country, in the mountains, and waiting and drawing Batista's soldiers in where they were easily defeated by the seasoned guerrillas. What ends up happening is that most of Batista's men, rather than venturing into the mountains, just waited outside for Castro to come out. Well, he didn't. By the end of 1958, as this movement continued to threaten the legitimacy of Batista's dictatorship, his grip on power began to slip. And in 1958, facing enormous pressure from the United States, Batista held an election. Surprising nobody, Batista won the election in a landslide. The election was widely recognized as a farce, and the general discontent, and even middle-class people who were very upset at the corruption engendered by the Batista campaign, meant that he had lost almost all of his support. At this point, the military tide had turned, and 1,000 troops were easily outmaneuvering the inexperienced corps and the corrupt officers of the 40,000-strong Cuban armies. And then, on December 29th, guerrilla warriors under the leadership of Che Guevara attacked and captured Santa Clara. It fell on New Year's Day. At this point, Batista knew that the gig was up, and he abandoned Cuba. He was in a New Year's Eve party. He left the party, took a plane to the Dominican Republic, where his fellow dictator, Leonidas Trujillo, was waiting for him. The revolution had succeeded. The revolutionaries had won with a force that did not exceed 3,000 people when they were victorious. Now, Castro had won enormous prestige. He had won enormous prestige during this war. And in fact, this vacuum in power, which was left by Batista as he fled to the Dominican Republic at the end of his dictatorship, Castro was easily able to step into that vacuum created by the dictator's departure and become the leader of Cuba. And Castro, let's recognize that at the time, he was especially popular with the poor, with the working class, many people in the middle class, but above all, the youth, right? This is the 1960s. This is a time of general youthful upheaval around the world that included Cuba. And Castro was able to get everyone involved in this revolution. To save Cuba, right, was to become part of the revolution. And he enlisted everybody he could into supporting this new revolution, turning the Cubans into what he called new men, right? The idea of the new man, it was the idea of a moral revolution. People would work for the good of Cuba, and they would be incentivized by doing social good rather than by winning material rewards. This was part and parcel to the ideas of socialism that Castro was increasingly embracing, right? Basically anti-capitalistic in its aim. The idea was that people would work not really for material good, but for the gain of their entire country and their community and their people. Now, what did Castro do to improve the lot of the people who were involved in the revolution? Well, first of all, there were campaigns to educate the illiterate countryside, right? But by going out and sending teachers to the countryside to teach people how to read, and many people, especially young teachers, really got involved in this movement. They also indoctrinated them with the ideas of the revolution, helping to win over peasants who had not been very politically involved before to the revolutionary cause. Another attempt to both uplift the people of Cuba, but also to get them involved in this new revolutionary regime, which Castro had brought to Cuba, was to initiate militias, right? Now the people would take up arms in defense of their country against outside influence and outside invasion. Always a threat when the United States was so nearby. The elites were effectively removed from the political equation, and momentum for radical innovation grew very quickly. Soon, Castro executed 550 of Batista's top men, and the property of all potential enemies was taken by the government. Something else interesting that Castro did was that, yes, there was assassinations, there were brutal attempts to repress any opposition to Castro, but Castro also, for at least the first 15 years of his regime, allowed most dissidents who were unhappy with the regime to simply leave. And many of them immigrated to Florida, right? This looked like clemency. Okay, well, if you don't like the regime, you're welcome to leave. But in fact, it also got rid of any political enemies within Cuba, meaning that those who remained behind were more likely to be loyal to Castro's regime. In any case, Castro had promised revolution. In 1959, he begins delivering. Just like we see in so many of these revolutions across Latin America, there's basically three aims to bring more power to the people. First of all, by allowing the working class a greater say, greater wages, greater control over their lives. The 1959 urban reform law resulted in massive rent reductions and increased wages for working people who lived in the cities of Cuba. Another aim of the revolution was to, like so many other revolutions in Latin America, was land reform, to get some of the land back into the hands of the people who had lost it to large corporate farms in the first half of the 20th century. And the Agrarian Law of May 17, 1959 was intended to do just that. What it did was expropriate and redistribute the largest agricultural properties, allowing the people to reclaim lands that they had lost long ago. Finally, Castro also oversaw the nationalization of sugar and cattle lands. And again, this was another thing which revolutionary governments had accomplished across Latin America in the early 20th century. Most famously, of course, in 1938, the Mexican government had nationalized U.S. oil holdings and taken over the oil industry in that country. Guatemala had attempted to nationalize lands which were owned by the United Fruit Company and were not being put to productive use by them. What this does is it dovetails with this idea of nationalism that fueled so many of these revolutions. Let's get rid of foreigners. Foreigners own too much of our land and too much of our resources. Let's take them back, right? Let's take them back. So, improving conditions for the working class, making land available to the poor, and nationalizing resources to be found in their country were all revolutionary goals, which Castro started going about achieving almost immediately, right? After Castro took over the government, small and medium land holdings dominated, and they were put to many diverse use. But as a result, Cuba did become more equitable as it moved towards socialism. In fact, peasants had been quite supportive of the revolution. Land was broken up into smaller and smaller parcels to make sure that everybody had access to that land. And in 1963, it became illegal to hold more than 67 hectares, that's about 165 acres, of land in an attempt to further socialize land holdings. Now, there were still some small and medium-sized farms, but for the most part, you had very small farms. The excess land, which was left over after being redistributed, were turned over to the government, and the government turned them into state farms. That is, farms which were run by the government. Socialization of land. There were still some small farms and medium farms. Large businesses in Cuba were also broken up. And after 1959, actually many new small businesses emerged to take up the economic space which had been left vacant after these large corporations were broken up. But overall, the effort by the Cuban government was to always thwart private property, especially since rationing encouraged private producers to make things for the black market, right? If the state did not oversee the production on these farms, sometimes farms kind of skirted the law to produce things which were in short supply in Cuba, and then to sell them at much higher prices on the black market. Of course, this was a problem that threatened the overall program that Castro imagined. Cuba also had difficulty with its financial policy, in no small part because Castro made Che Guevara the head of the treasury, after the revolution. Now, Che Guevara had the revolutionary and utopian idea of trying to move the Cuban economy off of a cash basis, since he believed that money, currency, cash, was based upon the inherently unequal idea of value. Guevara tried to get people to do their work for moral rewards, a button or a pat on the back, rather than cash rewards for jobs well done. Now, this idea of this new man who would work hard to help his nation rather than to improve his own material circumstances, that was perhaps the most utopian aspect of this revolution. It was also one of the most unsuccessful aspects of this revolution because, of course, people rarely work harder than they need to unless they are given cash incentives. And even Eastern Europe, which was communist at the time, had economic incentives to get people to do more work. As far as land redistribution is concerned, originally, just like Zapata's peasants, the people in the countryside had hoped that they would be rewarded with land. And they were, at first. But in the 1960s, the state took over more and more lands for a couple of reasons. First of all, it hoped to renew sugar production. Cuba's gross domestic product and economic exports fell precipitously after the revolution because the sugar was not being produced on the scale that it had been under Batista. Castro, in order to improve the economy of Cuba, hoped to get them producing sugar again. But there were other reasons that the economy was having such a hard time as well. The state increasingly took over to encourage sugar production, and also because they started to realize that people who were on farms which they privately held were often producing goods which they then sold on the black markets. There were food shortages in Cuba beginning in 1962, so there was always demand for foodstuffs that was not available to them. So farmers who owned their own property were very likely to produce goods which they could sell on the black market at a profit. Of course, Cuba, in the case of Castro, believed that this betrayed the revolution, and increasingly private land ownership was cut down. Even small farms were incorporated into land owned by the government, and by 1977, state farms, that is, farms run by the government, made up nearly 80% of the agricultural surface in Cuba. And even the small farms and the private holdings that continue to exist, the line between a state farm and a privately held farm were very blurry because the privately held farms were regulated very heavily by the government. The distinction between the two was blurry since the state took such an active role in overseeing even the smallest of private holdings. Accordingly, the emphasis was increasingly on state farms since Castro wanted the oversight, and he was trying to get rid of all types of private property, and he was trying to suffocate the black market. Castro, of course, had hoped that Cuba would be able to break its dependency upon sugar, and he initiated a crash course in industrialization. This is another example of Latin American countries in the 20th century trying to industrialize so that they did not have to depend upon foreign imports so much. But crash industrialization did not make up for the shortfall in profits that had resulted from cutting back on sugar production. In 1968, Castro went ahead and socialized all private businesses that remained, restaurants, laundries, and the like. Ironically, many of these businesses developed after the revolution, but by 1968, Castro believed that any sort of private property betrayed the social aims of the revolution, took up these private businesses, these private land holdings, incorporated them into the state, and used the state to run them. In fact, the only capitalist segment that remained in Cuba by the late 1960s were small farmers, and their rights and their freedoms were severely curtailed by strict supervision from the state. What are the results of the state taking such an active, some would say overbearing role in managing the economy? Well, wage differences were compacted. No one made that much money, but they all made about the same. Now, did Cuban people have enough money to feed themselves and to take care of themselves? Well, that's arguable. It depends upon who you talk to, but you do have to give the Castro regime credit for building a social welfare state that, while Cubans didn't necessarily have access to the cash and the capital that they might have had in the Batista era, they did have access to certain social welfare programs which just did not exist. Cubans were now entitled to an education, to free health care, to transportation, to a retirement fund, to housing, which was affordable, and even vacations. Every year, citizens from the cradle to the grave were taken care of by the government, and the state stepped in to produce security where wages did not. What's the result? Greater equality. Now, were there rich in Cuba? No, socialism didn't allow for that. But the number of people in Cuba who were desperately poor was also decreased. What happens is that there was a compacting of wages towards the middle. Most everybody made a bare minimum of wages, but they could depend upon the government to provide them with certain social services that took care of their health, their housing, and their well-being. So this was a social revolution. It took from the rich and gave to the needy, and arguably, this is a very controversial statement, but arguably the majority of people in Cuba were better off after the revolution than before the revolution.